Hello there, my friends. Picture this, it's 1692, and in a small Massachusetts village, neighbors are pointing fingers, families are torn apart, and innocent people are losing their lives. Witches, trials, and mass hysteria. But what really happened during the Salem Witch Trials? Today, we're diving into one of the most misunderstood chapters in American history, and I promise we'll be busting some myths along the way. You might be surprised by what you learn. Here's the big question I want you to keep in mind. Was it really about witches? Or was something much deeper going on in this troubled community? Let's find out together. Now, to understand what happened, we need to step back in time and see what life was like for these folks. Imagine living in Puritan New England in 1692. This wasn't the comfortable America we know today. These were deeply religious people who believed the devil was constantly trying to tempt them. Their lives revolved around strict church attendance, prayer, and following rigid moral codes. Entertainment, hardly any. Dancing, forbidden. Even smiling too much could raise eyebrows. But here's what made things even harder. They were struggling just to survive. The winters were absolutely brutal, imagine. Heating your home with just a fireplace and hoping your food supplies would last. Crops had been failing, which meant families were going hungry. And if that wasn't enough stress, they lived in constant fear of attacks from Native American tribes, who were, understandably, fighting to protect their own lands. These colonists felt surrounded by danger on all sides. Think about it when you're cold, hungry, scared, and living under such strict rules, your nerves are already on edge. You're looking for someone to blame when things go wrong. And that's exactly the powder keg that was waiting to explode in Salem Village. So how did this all start? Well, it began with some young girls doing what young girls sometimes do, acting out. But in this strict Puritan world, there was no room for typical childhood behavior. It started with 9-year-old Betty Paris, she was the minister's daughter, and her 11-year-old cousin, Abigail Williams. These girls began having what we might call tantrums today. They'd scream, throw things, contort their bodies in strange ways, and claim they couldn't control themselves. Now, you and I might think, well, children act up sometimes. But remember, these Puritans believed the devil was always lurking. When the local doctor couldn't find a medical cause, he declared the girls must be under an evil hand, bewitched. The pressure on these young girls was enormous. The entire community was staring at them, demanding to know who had put a spell on them. So they did what frightened children often do, they pointed fingers. Here's a fascinating detail. The first person they accused was Tituba, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean who worked in the Paris household. She likely told the girls stories from her homeland, stories that seemed exotic and frightening to these sheltered Puritan children. When Tituba was arrested and questioned, something remarkable happened. Instead of denying everything, she confessed and began spinning elaborate tales about meeting the devil and seeing other witches flying through the air. Her vivid testimony absolutely captivated the community and convinced them that witches were indeed among them. And just like that, the fuse was lit. What happened next was truly tragic. The accusations spread like wildfire through the community. By the time it was all over, more than 200 people had been accused of witchcraft. Let me put that in perspective. Salem Village only had about 500 residents. That means nearly half the community was either accusing someone else, or living in terror. Now here's something that might surprise you, true or false. Were witches burned at the stake in Salem? False. That's one of the biggest myths about Salem. Not a single person was burned. That's something that happened in Europe, not in colonial America. Here's what actually happened. 19 people were hanged on what they called Gallows Hill. One man, 80-year-old Giles Corey, was crushed to death with heavy stones when he refused to enter a plea. And tragically, 5 more people died while imprisoned, waiting for their trials. But here's what's really shocking: the evidence they used to convict these people. They relied heavily on something called spectral evidence. What's that, you ask? Well, if someone claimed they saw your spirit, tormenting them in a dream or vision that could be used as proof in court. Imagine if someone today said, "I dreamed that my neighbor's ghost was pinching me," and that was considered legal evidence. It sounds absurd, doesn't it? But that's exactly what was happening. They also looked for devil's marks on people's bodies, basically. Any mole, birthmark, or blemish could be seen as proof of witchcraft. And if you owned a pet that seemed unusually smart or affectionate, well, That might be your familiar, a demon in animal form helping you cast spells. The whole thing spiraled completely out of control. Respected members of the community, including a former minister, were accused and executed. Even the wife of the governor was eventually accused, and that's when the authorities finally began to realize things had gone too far. Now, you're probably wondering, what was really going on here? Because surely these people weren't actually practicing witchcraft, right? Well, historians have studied this for centuries, and they've come up with several fascinating theories about what might have caused this tragedy. First, there's mass hysteria. You've probably seen this happen on a smaller scale, maybe in a workplace or community, where rumors spread and people start believing things that aren't true. In Salem, fear literally became contagious. When everyone around you believes in witches, it becomes easier to believe it yourself. Second, religious extremism played a huge role. These Puritans lived in constant fear of the devil. They saw his hand in everything: crop failures, illnesses, even accidents. When something went wrong, they immediately looked for someone to blame, and accusations of witchcraft provided easy answers. Third, and this is really important, many of the accusations came down to personal grudges and community conflicts. Salem Village and Salem Town had been feuding for years over land, politics, and church matters. The witch trials became a way for people to settle old scores with their neighbors. But here's a theory that might really surprise you. Some historians believe ergot poisoning might have played a role. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye grain, especially in wet conditions like Salem had experienced. When people eat bread made from infected grain, it can cause hallucinations, convulsions, and strange behavior, exactly the symptoms those first girls displayed. Now, ergot poisoning alone doesn't explain everything that happened, but it might have provided the spark that lit this tragic fire. The truth is, it was probably a perfect storm of all these factors coming together at once. But here's what's most important to understand. This was never really about witchcraft. It was about fear, control, and what happens when a community turns on itself. So how did this nightmare finally end? Well, by 1693, people began to come to their senses. The newly appointed governor, William Phips, disbanded the special witch court after his own wife was accused. Suddenly, the idea of spectral evidence didn't seem so reliable anymore. The remaining prisoners were released, and no more executions took place. But the damage was done. Families had been destroyed, innocent people had died, and the community was left to pick up the pieces. In the years that followed, something remarkable happened. Many of the people involved began to publicly apologize. In 1697, Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, stood in his church and publicly confessed his guilt and asked for forgiveness. The state of Massachusetts eventually provided financial compensation to the families of the victims. But perhaps most importantly, in 2001, more than 300 years later, Massachusetts officially exonerated the last 5 people who had never been cleared. Their names were finally fully cleared. Here's what one of the Salem judges wrote years later: "I desire to lie in the dust and to be humbled for it, in that I was a cause with others of so sad a calamity. It takes courage to admit when we've been terribly wrong, and I respect those who found that courage, even if it came too late for the victims." Now you might be thinking, well, that's ancient history. Something like that could never happen today. But I want you to think about this for a moment. How often in our own lives or in our communities do we rush to judgment? How quickly do we believe rumors or join in when everyone else is pointing fingers at someone? The Salem Witch Trials remind us of something very important. Fear can make smart, good people do terrible things. When we're scared or stressed, we look for simple explanations and easy targets to blame. But here's what I hope you'll remember from today's story. Before we judge others, we need to pause and ask ourselves, do we really know the whole story? Are we letting fear override our compassion and common sense? The people of Salem weren't monsters. They were ordinary folks who got caught up in extraordinary fear. And that's a lesson that's just as relevant today as it was 330 years ago. Well, my friends, I hope today's journey back to 1692 has been as eye-opening for you as it was for me to research and share. I'm curious what surprised you most about the Salem Witch Trials. Did any of these facts challenge what you thought you knew? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.